what we're starting off with is just a little recap of CADASIL, just for those, so everybody's on the same page, really. And just to give you a bit of background, but to those of you who've been here before, you'll know quite a bit about this. But I'll just tell you a little bit of new data as well, which is quite important when you're sort of trying to look at the severity of the disease. So CADASIL is what we call a monogenic disease. So this is where one gene, abnormality in one gene causes the disease. These are sort of rare, but they run in families. This is as opposed to what we call polygenic, where lots of different genes contribute to disease, and this is what causes most of the diseases that we all suffer. But they all have small effects, each gene does. But in monogenic disease, it's familial. And CADASIL is the most common monogenic form of stroke. And as you're all aware, Lupa, are you letting people in, I say?
Yeah.
Great. As you're all aware, it's caused by mutations in NOTCH3 gene, and this results in this abnormal protein collecting in the brain, and it results in characteristic symptoms. This is a structure of DNA, which, as you know, was discovered sort of 2 miles down the road in the Cavendish laboratory next to the Eagle pub. And this is where you have double helix, and you have these sort of base pairs which connect with each other and bind these two strands together. And just an abnormality in just one of these little units here is what causes CADASIL. And when we talk about familial diseases, we talk about diseases which are dominant and which are recessive. So you get, as you can see from the previous picture, you've got two strands of DNA, one here, the other here. And during conception, you have one strand from your mum and one strand from your dad. And in a dominant disease, you only need one copy of the abnormal gene to get the disease. So if say your dad's got one copy of the abnormal strand, if you have that abnormal strand passed to you, then you will get the disease. So that works out as a 50-50 chance of getting the disease. In recessive, you have to have two copies of the abnormal strand to get the disease. So this usually happens in sort of inbred families or in communities that, are living away from other groups of people. So they have a lot of intermarriage between the communities, because then you're much more likely to get one strand from the mum and one strand from the dad together. But CADASIL is a dominant disease. So in an autosomal dominant condition, you can see here, as we mentioned, dad's got the condition, dad's got two copies of DNA. So there's a 50% chance that that a child of his will have the abnormal DNA. So here just by chance, if he's got 4 children, by chance, 2 wouldn't have it and 2 would. So 2 would be affected and 2 wouldn't. But of course, for every child, it's a random process. So that's inheritance of CADASIL. And it results in abnormalities in these small blood vessels in the brain. So here's a big blood vessel in the brain. So when you have the sort of stroke you might often see on TV, a very big stroke where somebody can't speak and they're weak all down one side, etc. Very big stroke. That's due to blockage of the whole artery here. But in CADASIL, you get blockage of these small arteries which come off the big arteries, and we call these small vessels or perforating vessels. This is why it's called small vessel disease, a type of small vessel disease. Here you can see on the MRI scan the typical appearances. So these strokes, because they're caused by blockage of a very small artery, cause a small stroke. So the strokes tend to be quite small. And whether they cause symptoms depend on whether they disrupt an important pathway in the brain going up and down here. And the most common pathway is motor, so you get weakness. But quite often they just will occur in the part of the brain and not disrupt a pathway, so you won't notice they've happened. And you also get this more diffuse damage in the brain, which I always think of saying, I always think of as sort of scarring without a stroke. So sort of, and you can see that as a white change on there. We call that white matter hyperintensities. So these are the common symptoms of CADASIL. About 2/3 of people get migraine. Migraine usually has aura, so that's where you get, visual abnormalities, or you might get tingling down one side, or you might get speech abnormalities followed by headache. That's relatively rare in the general population with migraine. Most people get migraine without aura, but in CADASIL, most people get migraine with aura. Stroke, we'll talk a little bit more about this, dementia and depression. And less common, seizures are pretty rare, but there is this funny thing called CADASIL coma, where people get a migraine attack and then get reduced consciousness, may have seizures, go into hospital. People think they've got an encephalitis or some brain infection. But actually, this is part of CADASIL and it recovers on its own. And this was something actually we described about 20 years ago now. So this just shows you how common the symptoms are in people who come to the clinic. This is recruited 2016-23. So, about 70% of people have migraine, about 40% have strokes. The problem with psychiatric symptoms is depression is so common in the general population anyway. I think probably 25% of the population has depression. But you can see that anxiety and depression are more common in CADASIL. Whether that's just because, it's a stress of coping with the disease, the strokes, but there does seem to be some reason why depression may be a little more common in the disease. You can see about 10% have encephalopathy, 8% dementia, and 5% seizures. So, one thing people ask a lot is, what's the prognosis in CADASIL? And it's very difficult to give data on prognosis in an individual person, but we are lucky that we've now got really up-to-date data saying what it's like now. And this is the latest data, and I'll show you the paper in a moment. So the median, so the most common age at which people, if they've got CADASIL, would have a stroke is 60. And the most common age of dementia onset is 77. So that's the latest data now. This is data that Pat, as some of you, was Pat at the meeting, Amy? Oh, she popped out for a bit. Pat was a Thai doctor who got a very prestigious scholarship to come and work in Cambridge for a year. You can see him here. Here he is presenting his poster to the Princess of Thailand afterwards. And he did a lot of work to try and look at what the latest prognosis in CADASIL. You can download the paper if you want. You can from the code there. I'm going to talk a bit about that later, I think. So I'm going to come on to that later in research advances. But this really gives you the best data on what the prognosis is likely to be in CADASIL. And as you'll find out later, the very encouraging thing is the prognosis has improved quite a lot over the last 20 years, which is really good for a variety of reasons, but we can discuss. Just lastly, what do you really need to do? We'll talk a bit more about this later, but the key thing is to treat vascular risk factors. And this is really important in midlife. So, before people get any symptoms, we now know actually for all of cardiovascular disease, whether you've got CADASIL or whether you don't, damage to the arteries occurs in midlife, from midlife on. So it's really important to treat them early. And the two most important things we've identified for CADASIL, and this is through work with the data that everybody's kindly provided by joining the research register, is blood pressure and smoking. So this is advice. Just to give you an idea of how important these risk factors are, if somebody's got a CADASIL gene mutation and smokes, on average, they have stroke 10 years earlier. So it's a big difference. So this is what we would recommend, smoking, blood pressure, healthy eating, and really quite low blood pressure readings. If you're in midlife, we'd aim for upper reading systolic of 120, which is a lot lower than people would have gone in the past. So just to point out, and we've talked a little bit about prognosis, but the CADASIL is very variable. So increasingly, we're seeing some people have stroke earlier, but some people who are very well into their 70s or 80s without a stroke. And this variability can occur within families and certainly between families. Why is there this variability? I've just summarized a few things here. We've talked about smoking. We've talked about blood pressure. These numbers tell you the increased risk. So, that says 2.2 means if you smoke, you've got 2.2 times the risk of stroke. If you've got high blood pressure, you've got 1.3 times risk of stroke. The other thing on there is the position of the variant in the gene, and this is something that's been discovered maybe in the last 5 years or something. All right. So yes, actually, have you got whose computer are we going from? Oh, sorry, it's on here, isn't it? Okay, because what I wanted to do was just try and go into the website, actually. So I'll just come on to that in a moment, maybe just in a second if we can. So to show you about how you can find this information out for yourself from the website. But just lastly, increasingly we're seeing people with other types of disease, not CADASIL. There's a disease which is now got the acronym called CADASIL2. And this is in a different gene called HTRA1. We're sort of discovering what this means. It's still relatively new. It seems to be similar to CADASIL, perhaps slightly milder. Very, very similar picture with migraine, encephalopathy, strokes, cognitive impairment. And then there's another rarer disease called COL4, which is again similar, small vessel disease for affected, but it tends to cause more bleeds. So what I wanted to do was just finish by showing you the CADASIL website, just to show you where you can get some information here if you're interested. Because we're trying to, so let me move out of the way. We're trying to reorganize the website a bit. So if you've got any suggestions for the website, I'll come over and do that. If you've got any suggestions, then do let us know, or let CADASIL Support UK know, because we are trying to make it as user-friendly and easy to use as possible and have the sort of information that you would like on it. So there are things that would be useful to. But what I'm going to do is just take you through a couple of things. Let's just go in there, sure, and see if we can get it in. You can see the two most important sites at the top there. So here's the website. So just a few things. So there's a lot of videos on here, and Amy's kindly reorganized these. So if you go into the CADASIL videos, so if you want information, I think this is a really good way of finding information. It's very accessible to see a video on what is CADASIL cognitive. So if you, for example, there are useful things on how to manage cognitive symptoms, how CADASIL can affect, how to manage apathy, which is a common symptom that people get. And all of these are hosted on YouTube. So if you click on those, you'll go into YouTube. I won't, because then we'll get the adverts and things. But there's lived experience of CADASIL, which, very interesting, particularly if you've got a new diagnosis and you want to know what it's like to manage. Information on CADASIL research, information on family planning, and so on. So a lot of information there if you want it on the videos. Many of the questions people ask often, or contact us, are actually just on frequently asked questions. So things like, what about HRT? What about aspirin? What about all these things? They're all on here, so you can just look at frequently answered questions. You could find, the previous meetings are all here with videos, so you can just go into last year's meeting and look at videos of all the talks. If you click on any of them, it'll take you to the video of that talk again on YouTube. And also, a lot of people ask about EGFR and the position of the EGFR, this mutation site. So Amy's kindly produced something on this. I wouldn't get too hung up about it, because in the end, you can't change your genetic variant, and you can change things like your behavior and your risk factors. So that's much more important. But if you do want to find it out, Amy's done a nice diagram here of it, and she's done a table where you can actually find out where the abnormality is, where your protein changes. So, DNA is converted to proteins. So you can just look this up. This will be on your report. So your doctor should be able to tell you where it is, and then you can see which EGF repeat it is in. So all of that information is there if you want it. But if you've got any ideas for improving it, do let us know. And we can do that. And then, let's just go back to the presentation. So that gives you an idea of the CADASIL website. As you know, we do a lot of research here, and we're really grateful to people taking part in research. Most of that data I've shown you actually comes from the research database now. So if people want to join the database, they're very, very welcome to. We can recruit people who, we don't look after, but we do need to go through ethics, and they need to be on the system. So we have to put them on the hospital system for ethics reasons and things. So the register involves a brief history, brief cognitive testing, mood questionnaire, blood sample, and then we get MRI scans, which we can now ship around the country via the sort of NHS. If you're interested in taking part in this, then do contact Amy.